President Piñera announced a state of exception and the deployment of troops to southern Mapuche territories in Chile, meanwhile opposition lawmakers filed a constitutional accusation against him after being involved in the Pandora Papers investigation. After 19-month closure, Mexican borders with the U.S. will be reopened by November, Secretary Abroad announced. African foreign ministers will participate in the Executive Council of the African Union in Addis Ababa. Hello, welcome to From the South. On Wednesday, the Chilean opposition filed a constitutional accusation against President Sebastián Piñera after the Pandora Papers investigation linked him to accounts and deals in a tax haven. The mandatory will be looked into for his involvement in bribery, tax evasion, and embezzlement. The vast majority of opposition political forces have backed up the constitutional accusation against Piñera, which comes also by the national prosecutor Jorge Abad, that centers on the president's and family's ties to the sale of the Dominga mining project in 2010 through a financial inlet in the British Virgin Islands. Members of socialist and communist organizations, center-wing coalitions, and right-wing parties, they all have united against impunity and institutional corruption with a lawful resort in order to gain the Southern Republic's integrity in a time when other social sectors struggle against the aggressive government and cooperate double-agenda alliance.
It is absolutely unacceptable that a President of the Republic is using his position for personal business to benefit his family, carrying out operations in tax havens through his children's company, thus preventing a unique area on the planet from being declared a natural reserve, only to favor his personal interests, as we found out in this third clause. All the antecedents of this accusation allow us to say that there will be a majority support, and we also hope on the part of the deputies of the ruling party and then in the Senate to complete this process with the removal of the President of the Republic, Sebastián Piñera.
And in this context, the mandatory announced a state of exception and the deployment of troops to two southern regions where security forces have been repressing indigenous Mapuche communities demanding land rights. The move comes after the violent repression of Mapuche protesters in Santiago over the weekend. During the March for Mapuche Resistance and People's Autonomy, Denise Cortez, a 43-year-old lawyer with the People's Defense Office, was killed. The current presidential order will initially be in force for 15 days, but is extendable, President Piñera stated. Family members of the Venezuelan boy murdered last weekend in the Colombian municipality of Tibú arrived in Cucuta to claim his body. The boy's family asked for justice amid the punishment and offense backed up by international resentment. Darwin Rodriguez, the 12-year-old boy's uncle, urged authorities to capture whoever were responsible for the shooting of his nephew. The relatives claimed the beloved body in the Colombian morgue. Meanwhile, the Colombian Police Inspector General Carlos Ernesto Rodriguez arrived at the area to lead the investigations. Deportations from North America to Guatemala continue at the same rate as deportations or repatriations to Haiti, according to authorities from the Guatemalan Migration Institute. Around 14,000 people have arrived in Guatemala by air and more frequently by land. Of these, over 10,000 are Honduran nationals, 2,000 are Salvadoran, and another 8,000 are Guatemalan citizens. Migration authorities in the Central American country insisted on getting the necessary information from Mexico and the United States about the asylum seekers' movements because in the case of returning them to Guatemala, they must do it to the authorized channels. These deportations caused tense situations such as the one at the El Seibo border, where hundreds of people survived in inhumane conditions. A crisis worsened since deportations occur daily, and many times it is a matter of entire families. Several Guatemalan legislators protested against the situation and demanded more commitment from Mexico and the U.S. Haitian former First Lady Martine Moïse and two of her children have filed a complaint against Prime Minister Ariel Henry and other officials for allegedly being involved in the assassination of her husband, Jovenel Moïse. Martine's attorneys said the complaint against Henry is based on the telephone conversations he had with Joseph Felix Badillo on the night of the murder. The police issued a search notice against Badillo for allegedly playing a role in the assassination in July. Moïse and her son and daughter also filed complaints against Badillo, Paul Diniz, James Solages, Dmitry Erard, and other people involved. Local media reports did not specify the alleged role of each person accused. However, with the exception of Diniz, a former Minister of Justice, most of the accused are people already implicated in the July 7th murder by investigators and judicial authorities. We'll be right back after this very short break. Welcome back. On Wednesday, Mexico's Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard announced a reopening of borders with the U.S. in November. The announcement comes after several months of negotiations between officials from both countries and a final agreement on Tuesday after U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas announced the reopening to the Mexican government. As part of the border reopening requirements, only fully vaccinated people can go through the crossing points. Mexico applied 3.7 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine in all municipalities bordering the U.S. The border reopening comes after 19 months of closure to non-essential transit since March 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
We have been working very closely, I would say. Yesterday we held a number of meetings to address this specific issue. U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas confirmed me yesterday night that during the first days of November they will determine the specific date. We'll inform you later about it as soon as we know it, but starting November, activities at the border will renew, meaning that travel by land and air will be allowed to the U.S. for people who have received the vaccine. Vaccination will be the basis for world travel.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas directed United States immigration authorities to stop massive worksite arrest of undocumented immigrants. This action is part of the Biden administration's efforts to narrow the scope of who can be arrested and be detained by U.S. immigration officials. In a memo, Mayorkas outlined new enforcement priorities that aim to target employers that exploit unauthorized immigrants. Such employers often pay substandard wages, subject immigrants to unsafe working conditions, and facilitate human trafficking and child exploitation. He instructed immigration agency officials to develop policies within the next 60 days to carry out the change in enforcement priorities and deliver more severe consequences to exploitative employers. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov arrived in Cuba on Tuesday on a work visit to strengthen diplomatic relations with President Miguel Diaz-Canel. The officials discussed economic, trade, financial, and cooperation ties, as well as the prospects for their development. President Diaz-Canel thanked Russia for the help offered to confront the COVID-19 pandemic in the midst of the tightening of the blockade imposed by the United States on the island for almost 6 decades. Both countries maintain a political dialogue at the highest level and closer relations in areas such as cargo and passenger transportation and electric energy development. At the Energy Forum in Moscow, President Vladimir Putin highlighted the urgency of establishing the gas market, with Europe facing an energy crisis ahead of winter after rising prices and a low on supplies. Putin stressed on the matter, saying it is very important to usher a long-term mechanism seeking to stabilize the energy market, adding there were systematic flaws in Europe's approach on economy. Some try to pass their errors onto others, stated Putin, in response to the tense situation between Moscow and Brussels and the U.S. involvement in the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline opposition, claiming Russia uses it as geopolitical leverage. The Russian president made clear that those who saw his country as the cause of the current state of things in Europe simply did not know what they were saying.
And prospects of global energy industry and its main tendency, as well as to suggest a long-term mechanism to stabilize the energy market, which is especially important in current difficult situation. Russia in practice will strive for carbon neutrality of its economy, and we set a benchmark for this, no later than 2060.
On the note of Russia's diplomatic strife with the U.S., Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov met with the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland. The discussion centered on the status and prospects of bilateral relations, with an emphasis on the activities of the respective diplomatic missions on each other's territory. Ryabkov highlighted that the hostile anti-Russian expressions will not remain unanswered, despite Moscow's interest on non-escalation. Ryabkov suggested removing all of the restrictions that the both sides have imposed on each other in the past years. Spain Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez traveled to La Palma Island on Wednesday to assess the current situation after Cumbre Vieja volcano's eruption and the recovery works. Sanchez asked the inhabitants of La Palma for patience because nothing can be done until the eruption of the volcano is over. The executive said that for now the government has allocated 214 million euros to the volcanic eruption of La Palma, but the final amount will not be known until the whole reconstruction. Experts forecast the volcanic activity will not cease in a short term, with the Cumbre Vieja still erupting and spewing lava. We have more stories coming up after this final short break, but first we invite you to watch a video on the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention of Biological Diversity, COP15. Welcome back. Foreign ministers from several African countries arrived in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, to participate in the ordinary session of the Executive Council of the African Union. For 2 days, the foreign ministers will discuss, among other issues, the implementation of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the 2022 roadmap, whose main content will be related to food security. Under the theme Art, Culture and Heritage, level skills to build the Africa we want. The 39th Ordinary Session will also consider the report on African candidatures of the international system and the follow-up to the implementation of the Agenda 2063. They will also analyze the draft agenda in addition to preparing the draft provisions and declarations to be determined by the heads of state and government of the continent during the third mid-year coordination meeting between the African Union, the regional economic communities, and the regional mechanism on October 16th. On Wednesday, Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta rejected the ICJ's ruling in favor of Somalia on the maritime border dispute between the two neighboring countries. President Kenyatta warned that the judgment of the UN High Court will hinder relations between Kenya and Somalia.
Kenya is not surprised by the decision. It is profoundly concerned by the import of the decision and its implications for the Horn of Africa region and international law generally. At the very onset, Kenya wishes to indicate that it rejects in totality and does not recognize the findings in the decision. This decision is, in the circumstances, a zero-sum game, which will only strain the relations between our two countries. It will also reverse the social, political, and economic gains and potentially aggravate the peace and security situation in the fragile Horn of Africa region.
Kenyans reacted to the news of the UN's top court handing Somalia control of most of the potential oil and gas-rich chunk of the Indian Ocean.
Really pleased as Kenyans because our territory has been taken away from us. So our government is very steadfast. We are going to defend our border. Right now we have Kenyan troops in Somalia under AMISOM. Now we are going to call them and station them at that border to secure our border because there's no way we can now be defending an enemy and instead of securing our border. So we as Kenyans, we are going to urge our government to defend our territory with all means possible. Even if it means using military force, we are going to really deploy that. We are not.
The government of Ethiopia deployed soldiers and police officers in schools in response to pro-democracy student protests leading to the closure of dozens of schools, while popular organizations have denounced shootings and arrests of demonstrators, including children. The president of the National Teachers Association of the South African country, Mbunga Ndlamini, reported that uniformed officers entered schools in the city of Mbabane, where students were protesting in favor of democracy and the release of two imprisoned lawmakers. Police using firearms arrested some of the participants in the protests, including minors. China, with a population of about 1.3 million, has been ruled as an absolute monarchy since 1986 that controls parliament and appoints ministers, which has led to criticism of its monopoly on power. The humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan has worsened since the Taliban implemented their new form of rule, with children suffering critical violations of their rights on a daily basis. In recent months, hundreds of minors have fled to neighboring Pakistan, where they are now trying to reach safety and avoid being victims of the worst punishments and forced labor they are subjected to. Since the end of May, almost 250,000 Afghans have been forced to flee, a situation that is worrying the United Nations Refugee Agency, which is predicting a new massive wave of Afghans by the end of this year. The growing displacement of Afghan children to other countries is compounded by the extreme poverty in which they live and the lower levels of literacy. Cuban scientists are debated about the future perspectives that the nation is facing in the fight against COVID-19. This happens at a time when a country with 3 vaccines are already approved and in the middle of a massive immunization process is getting ready to move towards a new post-pandemic normality. Scientists demonstrated a sustained decline in the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 on the island. The meeting chaired by President Miguel Diaz-Canel showed the advantages made in containing the pandemic in all the provinces in the country. In this regard, the mandatory recorded that the number of people recovered from this is 97.5%, while the world average is 90.46%, and in the Americas, 85.3%. Dr. Raul Guinovart, Dean of the Faculty of Mathematics and Computing at the University of Havana, stressed that the Cuban success lies in a combination of the entire population complying with the biosecurity measures instructed by the government.
That says a lot about the quality of the healthcare process, but also about the whole vaccination process, about the effectiveness of the vaccines, which have been able to stop this and saved a lot of people.
Cuban scientists stated that although the Delta variant will be present in the country at least until December, the level of vaccination and the extraordinary biosecurity measures implemented by the government followed in an orderly manner by the population will make it possible to contain the spread of the virus.
The predictions carried out by the Faculty of Mathematics, Dr. Raul Guinovart, showed that Delta will be present at least until December and will be the variant that predominates in our country. Logically, Cuba is carrying out an intense and effective vaccination campaign, but the virus is there. We have to achieve a great coverage between the biosecurity and epidemiological measures and the vaccination.
As explained before, there is a high level of transmission of the Delta variant in our country and in the world, which has made some vaccines to be less effective. There is a risk of new variants emerging, so it will be good to increase immunity in our population to have better protection in the future.
We've come to the end of today's news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at TeleSUR English. You can also follow us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I am Ray Gomez. Thank you for watching.
Huela,